Hi, I'm Carol Fitzgerald from Reading Group Guides, a website from the Book Report Network, and I'm the host of the Book Reporter Talks To video podcast series. And I am so excited to welcome you all to our Bookaccino Live book group tonight, where our guest this evening is Courtney Sullivan. And we're going to be talking about The Cliffs, which is a Reese's Book Club pick and was one of my Book Reporter Bets On selections. Bronwyn Miller, who is one of our reviewers, had this to say about it in our Book Reporter review. Courtney Sullivan expertly walks the fine line between an engagingly creepy mystery and the troubled history of the Pines Tree State and its subsequent sanitation. It takes a steady, adroit hand to entertain as well as educate, and Sullivan does exactly this with The Cliffs. So let's talk about what the format is going to be this evening. Let me start by noting that this is the kind of book club where you did read the book. You're not just here for the wine. So we're assuming that everyone has read the book. Okay, so we're going to have spoilers. Just a warning ahead. I'm going to begin with a conversation with Courtney, and then our readers will be joining us live. One of our readers will be joining us live to talk about The Cliffs. And then we're going to be taking questions from the audience. Now, if you have a question, please drop it into the Q&A area down below, not into the chat. Our voice of God, Tom Donadio, our editorial director, is going to be looking in the Q&A area for the questions. So make sure that that's where you're putting your questions throughout the evening. And then we'll get to those as the formal part of the evening ends and we go to Q&A. So with that housekeeping behind us, let's welcome Courtney to the stage. Hi, Courtney.
Hello. Hi.
It is so nice to meet you. I can't believe in all my travels over the last 29 years, we have not crossed paths. Like, how have I missed meeting her in person?
I'm so happy to finally meet you.
I know, this is great. I was thinking this afternoon, and I was like, wait, where does she usually travel? What time of year does she go out that I don't see her? So this is great to be able to do this. So let's start with you giving us an overview of The Cliffs. Just give us your elevator pitch.
Well, so my elevator pitch, it has changed. So the original elevator pitch was, I would say that this is a book about a house on a seaside cliff in Maine and all the women who live in that house and on the land over 400 years. And going a little further, I would say, like all of my books, I think this one, but maybe even more so than the others, this one is concerned with the idea that the moment a woman is born determines so much of who she's allowed to become.
Hmm.
And that it touches on themes of family and friendship and addiction and faith and the role it plays or doesn't play in our lives. But I have to tell you that last summer, I was on book tour when the hardcover came out, and I live outside of Boston. So at this particular day, I was doing an event in Boston, and it was just kind of a frantic week because my kids are in two different day camps, and we're trying to, juggle book tour in the middle of all of that. And so my husband and I went to pick up our son at hockey camp and in Boston. And then we were planning to come back to the suburbs. I was going to drop everyone off and go back into Boston, but we realized we were both kind of like, we suffer from time blindness and have no concept of reality as it, applies to time. So we realized, oh, we're too late. They're going to have to just drop me off at the bookstore. It was beautiful Beacon Hill Books in Boston. And so my son's friend in the back seat was very annoyed about this. Like, why do we have to take this detour? What are we doing? Where are we going? And, my son said, well, my mom is a writer. She writes books, and she's going to talk about one of her books tonight. These kids are 6, by the way. And so, the other kid says, well, are the books for kids? And he says, no, they're for adults. And, well, what is it about? And so my son said, oh, well, my mom's book, it's about these people who build a mega mansion on top of ghosts and how women's power will kill you. And so I'm like, wow, what a great backseat elevator pitch. I am sticking with that as my description from now on.
I love that. I love that. I also have time wine this, so I love that you're sitting there saying that. Yeah.
Oh, good. Yes.
We can get there. My husband goes, yeah, at the end of the movie, if we start moving in that direction. But isn't
Yes.
it interesting the way he is sharing what your book is about. Like just from hearing you talk about it or whatever, what he takes away at 6. And he's sitting there going, well, this is what my mom does, this, and explaining to his friend why we can't go straight home. We have to get my mom to her event,
Right,
I love
right.
that. I love that. I see your book is full of character, history, and stories all woven together. Did it start out this way, or what was your entry point to this?
So my entry point to this particular book was a real house that um, was very similar to the house as described in the book. It was an old house on a cliff in southern Maine. Um, my husband and I, this was before we had kids, my husband and I and our friends, another couple, we would go to Maine together every summer and, for a week or something. And we were on vacation there. Um, and uh, this is I've grown up going to Agunquit, Maine, Cape
Mhm.
Nettic, Maine, that area my whole life. I've gone there every summer of my life, and that is my happy place. I love it so much. My husband is a Midwesterner. He's from Iowa. So when I first met him, he said he didn't like the ocean. And I was like, ooh, I don't know about that. But now he loves the ocean. Thank goodness. And this other couple, these are his best friends from Iowa. So we're driving around this area that I feel like I know so well. And yet we happen to go down this street that I guess I've never gone down before. And at the end of it is this beautiful home. And it was such a contradiction because it was beautiful, but it was clearly abandoned. So clearly abandoned that my friend Melissa and I felt emboldened to go right up and look in the windows. And our husbands were, in the driveway saying, like, this is trespassing, this is illegal, what are you doing? But we were so curious. And when we looked inside, became even more curious because this beautiful house, it still was fully furnished down to these little details. So there was still furniture in all the rooms, beautiful, really nice, rugs on the floors and paintings on the walls. There was a dollhouse in the living room and all these things that just as a writer, were just sparking imagination and really sparking questions, which I think is usually the starting point for me of any book. It's like, who lived here and where did they go and why did they leave in such a hurry, especially? And so every summer thereafter, when we would meet our friends, we would pick them up at the airport in Maine and we would drive directly to the house. That was the first place we went every summer to check it out. And, it always looked a little worse for wear. And there was always some surprise that indicated that someone else had been there, not the owners, but someone. Like one year, all the kitchen appliances had been taken. I have no idea why or by who, but they were gone. And so we do this for 5 or 6 summers. And even though it's not our house, none of us could ever afford to have this house, we kind of feel like it is our house.
Mhm.
And after maybe 5 or 6 years, we drive down the street one day, we get there, the house is gone. It has been demolished. And in its place is the foundation for what will clearly be, as my son said, a mega mansion.
Mhm.
And, there used to be this beautiful rolling green lawn down to the ocean and the cliffs. There's really not a lawn because it's such a large house that there's, it's just like as far as it can go out in every direction. And at that point, I just felt so sad. And it was really then that I started writing this. I wrote the house, I don't have any artistic ability as far as painting or drawing, but I wrote down what had been in every single room as far as I had seen. And like the banister had caved into the front hall, things like that. For those who've read the book, which I love that you said spoilers are allowed, you'll probably, you may remember a lot of these details are in the story. So I did keep the house, and this is something that no reader would really care about, but it's just for me, I kept the house exactly as it was. So these details like the dollhouse, the fallen banister,
Mhm.
all of these things. People often ask, and even the marbles? No, the marbles were the one thing that weren't,
Marbles are
weren't in.
different. Those are different.
Uh, but yeah, so I wrote the house, but then I didn't know what to do with that. And I put it aside, I wrote a totally different book, which is my novel Friends and Strangers.
Wow.
And it wasn't until 4 years later that it was the start of COVID. We were shut away in our homes. My kids were not quite 2 and not quite 3, so it was chaos. And when they were sleeping, I started doing, my favorite thing in life, which is to go down research rabbit holes. And they were kind of inspired by where we were in that moment. So we were living in suburban Albany for a very short period of time, just a few months, after spending about 20 years in New York. We were then making the transition that ended up back in Massachusetts, in my hometown where we now live. And so in Albany, no one was speaking to their neighbors, and especially not a random family that just arrived from Brooklyn. And so we were really kind of unto ourselves. And the only places I could take my kids, because at that time you couldn't go to even a playground, everything was closed. I could take them to the colonial era cemetery, which was full of mothers with young children. It was the closest approximation, to a park. And the other place I could take them to run around outside was the Shaker Village in Albany, the original Shaker Village. And being in these places, I started thinking, I thought about how my mother, when I was a kid, had taken us to Sabbath Day Lake Shaker Village in Maine. And what was that all about? And so that was one rabbit hole that I started traveling down. I read this fabulous book about mediumship and the history of spiritualism, especially as it happened in one camp in Maine. A book by Mira Patassin, which is called The In-Betweens. And that led me down the rabbit hole of mediums and spiritualists. And even though I was in Albany, all of these rabbit holes were taking me back to Maine in some way or another. And at some point, it kind of dawned on me that the house will be the vessel for these women's stories, that unfold in different eras.
Wow.
That was a long answer. Sorry.
No, it's a great answer. My one question is, did you ever try to research who had owned that house? Like, these days you can actually go online and figure out, did you ever go back and do that and just to see who it was before it was demolished?
I did. And so it was interesting because my full-time job before I was a novelist full-time, I was a researcher at the New York Times. I used to be the researcher for a couple of the opinion columnists there. And I love nothing more than to do research. It is like, I just love it. And it's so funny because when I had that job, I always thought, this is the thing I'm doing until I can write fiction. And then as soon as I was done, and quit my day job and started writing novels full time, I realized I love doing research. I have to keep it part of what I do. And so I think with wait, what was the question? Now I've completely gone off the rails.
Try to see who owned the house. It's okay.
Now in middle age, I'm finding this Venn diagram of research lover and busybody. I am both. And so, I'm often, let me look up that house. Let me look up who's lived there and, all of that. With this house, and I don't know if it was just that long ago that, things weren't quite as evolved in this way, or if I just didn't have my full busybody about me yet. I know I looked into it before I wrote the book. Couldn't really find much about who the owner was. I knew the owner was someone, an older man who had retired to Florida. Okay. But all I had was that and this person's name. There wasn't much to it. Then when the house was demolished, I figured out that who had bought it, and it was a developer. And so I wasn't sure. I actually didn't even consider that he was buying it for himself. He was actually. It's now him and his wife who live there. But I thought he must be buying it, for a client to whatever. So I emailed him a couple of times and I asked him if he had any pictures of the house as it was and if he had kept anything that was inside. And I told him, exactly why I was asking, that I was writing this novel and it's hard to explain, but it's not based on your house, but it's inspired by your house or what was a house. And I never heard back from him. Mm-hmm. Oh my gosh. So, but after the book came out, there was a news item in Maine. And I had been all the way along, I had been trying to find a picture of the house because weirdly, my friend Melissa and I, we never took pictures there, which is so strange.
Yeah.
Um, and so I couldn't find a picture of the house. And then I had been working with somebody at a historical society there and in Maine. And he all of a sudden said, "Oh, I finally found a picture of the house." And so I told this local news crew who were doing this really beautiful big story about the town and everything in the book. Um, at the historical society, there's a picture of the house. And I didn't really think much of it. But of course, then this couple, they saw the house on the news and they're like, "That's our house." So I think they felt, a bit exposed, but they're not really exposed because it's not really their house in the
Right,
book.
right, right.
Because as you know, in the book, the house doesn't get demolished. It just kind of gets added on to. And,
Well, the wife probably said, "Wait, she wrote you and you didn't answer?"
well, she did say, I wish you had reached out to us. And I said, "Well, actually, I did reach out to your
Here, let
husband."
me forward. Let me forward what I
Yes.
said to you in the past, just in
Yes.
case you missed it, just in case you missed what's going on. I love looking at older homes. It's one of my favorite things to do is just go look. And there's a beautiful street by us where we're near where I was growing up. And I went to parties in a lot of those houses when I was in high school. I tell you, I had a better social life when I was in high school than I have now. And these beautiful homes. And I remember one house, they had a swing set in one of the rooms and a slide. And I was like, "What's that about?" And they said, "Oh, I had asthma as a child, so I couldn't go outside. So they built me this inside." And I was like, "Okay, this is really good."
Wow.
So let's talk about Jane. She's upended her life. Okay. She's due to a
Yeah.
drunken episode. She's put on probationary from leave from her job. Her husband, David, has asked for her, I go away for a while and like, we'll see what we're going to do. So she's back in Maine with her tail between her legs and she's back home. This is a place she didn't want to return to. So tell us how you set her up like that. Why give her that backstory?
Yeah. Um, well, I wanted so anyone who loves Maine or any place like Maine will know that you're if even if you live there, you're not really a local unless you were born there and your great great grandfather was also born there. And there's a lot of pride in like what does it really mean to be from there? And so Jane did spend a lot of her growing up years in Maine living there. But she wasn't born there. Her family are still considered kind of outsiders. And I wanted her to have that feeling of being an outsider in this town because she's, that being an outsider has a lot of negative connotations but it also gives you the ability, much like a writer, I guess writers are often outsiders, to sort of observe everything, to see it all, and she does that. And she discovers this house just as I did as an adult. She discovers it as a teenager, and it's sort of her refuge from a troubled home life. It's where she goes, and unlike you, she doesn't have a wild high school social life, so she just reads books there. There's another kind of kid who would go there and have a wild party, but she reads books. And when she comes back, sort of in disarray, 20 years later, her marriage falling apart, her job in jeopardy, her mother has died. She still feels very much the outsider in this
Mhm.
place, but it's kind of like even though she doesn't have great feelings about home and her immediate family, when the shit hits the fan, you go home, if
Yeah.
at all possible. And
Yeah.
she does. And, she also has this kind of this cover, which is like, someone has to clean out our mother's house. Someone has to, do that work. And my sister lives there, but she's not doing it. So I guess it will be me.
Yeah. I guess it's going to be me. I'm going to have to be the person of doing this, Like,
Yes.
here we go. So the
Yes.
legacy of alcoholism is something you have at play here too, of what happens with that along the way. What drew you to write about that as part of the story and where Jane has been trying not to be in that world, all this time?
Yep. So, all of my books in some way, shape, or form talk about alcoholism.
Mhm.
And those that are about families usually get into uh, the way alcoholism kind of cycles through generations, and
Mhm.
the idea that it it will keep doing so until someone is brave enough to kind of say, hey, this is a problem and it's not going away, you know? I grew up in a family with a lot of alcohol. I, always, I think, kind of considered myself separate from it. And at a certain point realized like, actually, I wasn't. Actually, I was the same as everyone else, just in a different outfit, So Jane is very high functioning. Jane is very successful in her chosen field. And she very much looks at her, as she does with her town, kind of looks at her family of origin as like, I have nothing in common with them.
Mm-hmm.
And also judges their drinking. She herself is very clearly an alcoholic, but she doesn't own it until she owns it, And so I wanted her, I thought it would be an interesting challenge for me. I've written all different kinds of drunk characters at different, I've written people who've been sober for 30 years and I've written people who are never going to get sober. I thought it would be really a good challenge to write a character who's like in the middle. She's not drinking, until she is, but she's also like, well, if she's kind of hedging her bets. She's like, if my marriage, if he forgives me, like, maybe I'll go back to drinking. She's not committed yet to it. And she's in that sort of like messy middle space, which I think is something that everyone who quits drinking eventually has to kind of reckon with that.
Yeah, the messy, like if I have one more, is that going to be a bad thing? Is it going to get me back to where I was? What am I going to have to? Yeah. And there's a lot of grief and regret at the heart of the book as well. There's regret of what was my life like here? What did I do here? Did you go in knowing you were going to be exploring those feelings, or those ones that, you do that a lot in your books? I mean, you definitely do that. But was grief and regret something that you said, wait, what can I give to these characters?
Yeah, I think grief, I wasn't thinking about it as much, but then it became very clear, like it has to live in this book because her mother has died, and no matter what your relationship was with your mother. And I think actually, if you don't have a perfect relationship, that can be really difficult in its own way, because now this relationship will never be mended, and Jane would kind of come home and try to have these conversations with her mother. Her mother wanted nothing to do with that. And so now it's truly too late, And so this feeling that, of course, grief is going to be a part of that. And then when I started writing, especially Marilyn, there's just so much grief in her chapter and chapters. I can't remember a chapter. The loss that she suffers, she's, I think, much more, she has to figure out, how do you like walk through life with the most profound grief, but still do it, and so I think writing her sections was like very sad. Those were sad days.
How do you forgive yourself? How do you, look at yourself if you've done something, or you've been in a situation where you could never say what you really felt to somebody and now it's over? There's no chance to do it.
Right. And I think also, a more typical sense of loss in someone like Jane losing her mother, terrible, but, something that most people do face, versus what happens with Marilyn and her daughter. She just makes a totally different life. She just makes such a small life for herself. And I think sometimes, we're on a certain trajectory, all of us, but it's sort of fascinating that something can happen that will completely change the course of things. I actually never thought of this before, but, as I said, I started writing this in early COVID, and I feel like everyone had a crazy COVID thing. I have friends who had a baby they wouldn't have had otherwise, or got divorced and they wouldn't have otherwise, or they just got some kind of a poodle mix, that was a big one. And for me, it was, I moved back to my hometown, and I really never planned to do that. And even when I did, my whole family was like, you're not really here. Like, you're not really staying. This is a weird little COVID, honeymoon moment. But I did. And so I think maybe, very different than what Marilyn faces, but like if COVID hadn't happened, I don't think I would have moved back. And I'm so glad that I did, and I think we all had in various forms something like that,
Hmm.
where maybe not everyone, but many people, a big sort of
Hmm.
shift in
Yeah.
the path we were on.
Yeah. We had an office in New York for, umpteen years, and then it was over. It was like, okay, the lease is up, we're gone. And it was that
Yeah.
COVID year. And we just sat there and go, how are we going to do this? It was funny because we moved about 1,500 square feet of furniture to my house.
Oh, wow.
It was in the office. And my husband was hawking desks out of the garage, like, here's $25 for a desk, because everybody needed a desk and a chair because they were
Yeah.
home working. My husband became like the highlight of Facebook Marketplace, getting rid of office furniture, including 16 garbage cans. Everyone had to take a
Wow.
garbage can when they left. But you don't think about, it's like you making that big change to do that. We were, I mean, I was ready to renew a lease. If they had come in February, the lease would have been renewed. It wouldn't have changed. And
Right.
so many things that you now look back and go, wait, we were going to do what? And how much time did I spend commuting every day? And that was insane. But unless you stop doing what you're doing, you may not have moved home. And you're right. It was like a great thing. It was a great
Yeah.
thing. Kids, you, etc. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
So you also delve into Maine's very complicated history with Native Americans, and it's something that we already saw. We read The Berry Pickers as a book group selection, I
Oh,
guess about a year ago. So was this something new that you learned? Did you research? Where did that whole Native American backstory come from?
so I think, it's so funny because I always think that every novel is like sort of a time capsule of where the author was when they wrote it, right? And we as the readers don't always know, what was that? What was informing all of that? So for me, I was already writing the book. I already had, Jane, I had the Shaker, I had Marilyn, and I I was actually also trying to make the sisters who owned the house and during World War II era. I was trying to make them work in the story. They unfortunately are not in the story very much, but um, I it wasn't until I moved back to Massachusetts that I really started thinking about this indigenous history of this place, of New England. Not just Maine, but all of New England, and of course, Maine and Massachusetts used to be the same state anyway. Um, the area I'm writing about in the book is only about an hour and a half from where I live now, and where I live now, just outside of Boston. Um, I'm not too far from Plymouth, so I grew up with this story of Native people that
Hmm.
was really only ever talked about at Thanksgiving,
Hmm.
the week before Thanksgiving at school. It would be, now we're going to talk about Native Americans. And they were always presented as like these very cheerful, kind, knowledgeable about the earth people who, pilgrims arrived and they told us everything about how to grow corn. And then they just exited stage right. And that's the end of that.
Exactly.
And um, the story is so baked into what it means to grow up in New England that and it serves as kind of important and possibly kind of malicious role, which is like we are so proud and so obsessed with firsts here. Everything is the first
Right.
pub, the first library, the first school, and in my town, we have this small mountain, and at the top, it's America's first weather observatory,
Okay.
dated 1800 something. And so, every time I would go up there, I would think, but there were like 10,000 years of indigenous people living here before that. And I'm pretty sure observing the weather was a big part of what they did. That was kind of their whole thing. And so, you know, I walk my dog every morning on the Neponset River, which is right across from my house, and I think about that. I think about there's all this from different eras, from the 1930s. There's signage all over this area that talks about the native people, and most of the signs just say, the Indian tribe XYZ was here and they left. Like literally, that's what they say. And there was a push among these sort of antiquarian societies of that time period to put signage up. And when you drive around in New England, you know, or really anywhere in the US, many places in the US, um, you are just, I mean, if you don't pay attention, you don't pay attention. But if you are someone who does, there's sign after plaque after, rock that's carved that tell you, and so I did an event one time in Duxbury, Massachusetts. And I was like, oh, I stopped at that big rock down there because I saw that it had a huge plaque and I wanted to know what it meant. And all these people who live there are saying, what rock? What are you talking about? It's just there on the side of the road. And so I think a big part of it, a big part of what Jane reckons with and thinks about in her work, and I guess what I do too, is this idea of like, there's just so much history, and how do you tell the story, and how do you contain the story, and who gets to tell the story,
Right.
because the story is ever evolving. And so the story that I was told was, yes, respect for Native history, but no reckoning with the fact of basically genocide being committed against Native people so that white people could be here.
Mm-hmm.
And also the notion that these indigenous people are still here and are still in this ongoing battle for tribal sovereignty and land, all of these things. And so it just became very apparent that if I wanted to tell a story, like a complete history of this place, that had to be part of it.
I'll be part of. It's interesting because we're coming up on what, the 250th anniversary of the country and
Yep.
what that's going to mean. And it's
Yep.
going to be interesting to see how that is treated compared to the 200th. Like, where do we lay the Native American story in now that we perhaps were not doing quite the same way before? I mean, it used to be Pilgrim time. You put your little hat on. They always made hats
Yes.
like in, second grade, even with the feathers up the. And those people were then the pilgrim hats were the other children. And we all went and we had lunch at the table. And I don't know what we ate, like, whatever, but whatever the parents brought in. But that was like, it was a peaceful and everybody was happy. And you're right, it was like kumbaya time. Everybody was like completely happy. It's going to be interesting to see how even 50 years later, the story of the origins of the country. And I live in New Jersey, and we joke that Washington slept every place. He must have
That's
slept
right.
a lot because
That's right.
Washington slept here. And I was like,
Yeah.
man, this guy like traveled all over. And the only thing people noted was where he slept. And then he
Yeah.
crossed the river. And they do the river reenactment, like, every Christmas morning, Christmas Eve to Christmas morning. And I'm just saying there, or New Year's Eve, one or the other. But I'm just saying they're going, it's so interesting the way we play history back, play
Yeah.
like, what's going on. And I love that the book is dedicated to Donna Waring, and she's a tribal member of the Penobscot Indian Nation and they're representative to Maine state legislature. So tell us about her, and have you met her, and like, do you have a relationship with her as well?
I do. So I was very lucky to meet her in the process of writing this. Donna is friends with the author Christina Baker Klein, who's also a friend of mine, and Christina set the two of us up. Um, One lovely thing that happens with every book I write, I always make a friend somehow through the process of writing it. And Donna is the friend I made this time. She was incredibly instrumental in my being able to write those parts because I needed to know that I was doing it in concert with the people I'm writing about and not, just going with my own thoughts. Also, she's just a brilliant. I had like an hour long Zoom with her yesterday, just talking about the state of everything in the country, and so she's wonderful, and she's I've learned so much from her. But as you say, it's interesting because it is when we look at history, and if you read a history book, a history of the US written in 1850 versus 1950 versus 5 years ago versus now.
Right.
I'm worried about now because, as you said, here's this anniversary, here's this opportunity to tell a different story, and we have such pressure coming from conservatives to not tell the story, to really not get into it. And I think the main reason is, why should white people feel bad? I think that's the reason at the end of the day. And so I think we were getting there. We were really getting to a place where fuller, truer version of events could be told. And I fear what's happening around that.
But I feel like books like yours and books like The Berry Pickers are bringing it into fiction. And
Yeah.
it's the gateway in to telling the story. And there's a gateway in. There's another book, Go as a River, that took place out in Colorado. And those kinds of stories will bring you into history from a completely different way. And
Mhm.
you're going to sit there and you're going to go, wait a second, what really did happen? And how did this really impact our lives? Because we're far enough away from it now that we can sit there and say, what was undone? What wasn't right? And what are we going to do to celebrate that culture as well? Because now I think that what's what people are feeling is to be able to celebrate that country culture is important. To be able to sit
Yes.
there and say, who are the people there? And there've got to be people that are still living there that are descendants, because it's the same thing that happens on other
Yeah,
parts of Maine, of like, there are people that have been there all this time. And
that's right.
also, have we intermarried so much at this point that it's not as pure
Mhm.
Indian blood, pure, look, I'm Italian, the same kind of thing. I didn't marry an Italian guy, same
Yeah.
kind of a thing, that it's sort of more eclectic of what's going on. Best way to describe it is eclectic. And when you are that, you can sit there and look back and look and see what's going on in a different way, because you're
That's
really looking to inform yourself, because it wasn't your heritage you're fighting for, if that makes sense at
yeah.
all.
Yeah, I mean, I think also it's so important to like understand the roots of where we are now,
Mhm.
and so if you are a member of, for example, the Penobscot Nation, um, the law is that you must be what's called quarter blood. You must be at least 25%
Mhm.
Native American, and from that tribe in particular. And as you say, as sort of the world gets bigger and people leave their small communities, it is less and less likely that that is the case for all of us.
Mhm.
But in their case, it's really dire because you lose rights, you
Yes.
lose your citizenship
Mhm.
to the tribe if you do marry someone from outside, and if you yourself are not already 100%. So that is, thought of among activists like Donna Loring and others, a form of just another form of sort of trying to um, make the country as white as possible,
Mhm.
basically, um, and sort of deny the existence of Native people.
Mhm. And I'm saying it's like exciting to explore like who lived where when. And
Mhm.
I mean, I'm known for watching, okay, Yellowstone. I'm known, whether it's completely true or not, just to see the road to go west in 1883. Okay.
Mhm.
Just to see what was happening in 1923. And I don't
Yeah.
care if it's completely authentic or not, but there were no roads. You realize when these people were living up in Maine, it was a completely different world from what
Yeah.
you're doing, where you're living right now. And with the accessibility to water, the accessibility to get to crops, to whatever, it had a different mode of needing to be there than what we have right now. Like what you're seeing, you want to go to the beach. You want to go to the beach. If you can buy some fresh vegetables on the way home, like corn on the cob, fabulous, great. But it's not like that was where you were growing all your food, and why were you doing that? And it's no different than there's a book that took place in the South, and where the freed Negroes were given all the land by the water. And why were they given that? Because that's not where you could grow the crops. And now big hotels want this by the water. So if we're studying exactly what's happened in the country
Yeah.
because of everything that happened along the way, it's very, very interesting to take a look.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
so Debbie Moore is going to join us from Syracuse, New York. Debbie is a fabulous, fabulous reader, and she's always joining our program. So Debbie's got some questions for you.
Hi, Debbie.
Hi, Courtney. How are you? It's
Good. How are
nice.
you?
It's nice to meet a native New Englander. I grew up in New Hampshire and
Oh,
sp-
good.
and spent my summers in Maine, along the coast of Maine. So
Oh,
I
we're in Maine.
love this book. I love the setting. It was wonderful. I wanted to ask you about the part of the story about spiritualism, because
Mm.
I love the day that Genevieve and Allison and Jane spent in the spiritualist camp. Um, do you have an interest in spiritualism, or how did this become part of your story?
Yes, I love that question. Thank you. So, so as I said, I read this book by Mira Pitassin, and Mira is a good friend of mine. And so when I read her book, I was just I was sort of, fascinated and started reading more and more and more. I was probably primed to love the book because, yes, I do have a certain degree of woo-woo to me as a person, I always have. And so I was not a skeptic in any way. I was just like, oh, this is interesting. Let me find out more about this. I really didn't know, though, until I read her book, how big spiritualism was in this country and elsewhere in Europe as well, but especially in the US, particularly around the time of the Civil War. And, you had Mary Todd Lincoln, most famously, had mediums living in the White House so that could communicate with her sons who she had lost. And the average American would go to these camps. That's where you would have your summer vacation. You would go to the spiritualist camp. And the one that Mira writes about in her book, it's called Camp Etna. It's a real place in Maine, still exists to this day. My fictionalized version in the book was called Camp Mira in honor of Mira Potassin. But I went with Mira and also with Donna Loring, funny enough, because in addition to being brilliant activist and thinker, she also likes mediums. So we all went to Camp Etna together at different times. And very similar to the Shaker Village that I write about in the book, that was such a robust place for so long and such a big part. I mean, I think about the fact that Ken Burns, the first documentary he made in telling the story of America, which he's done so brilliantly, was about the Shakers, because the Shakers really did play this incredibly important role in the founding of the country. And yet now, Sabbath Day Lake Shaker Village, where Eliza lives in the book, in Maine, it's the only existing Shaker village in the world, and there are only 2 Shakers there. And so, maybe more people will join, but also it's quite possible that that's going to sort of die out. And similarly, if you go to Camp Etna, as I wrote about it in the book, that during the Civil War era, Etna, Maine, which is the name of the town that the camp is in, it's kind of in the middle of nowhere, but it became this vibrant place in the summertime. They laid down train tracks and started bringing the train from Portland to Camp Etna. They built hotels and restaurants, and a whole kind of town grew up around the mediums. And you can still go there as well to this day. But it's very reduced. There's not nearly as many mediums. Some days there might not be any mediums there who want to do a reading. And so this idea of these kind of like faith communities that serve a role in a certain time and what that does, over time. I think obviously when you think of the Civil War, it makes sense that so many Americans were losing young men in their lives, and they did not want to believe that that could be the end of that conversation. Mm-hmm. And, this goes back, I think, to Carol's question about grief in the book. I think one thing that's really incredible about grief, as it, shows itself through the mediums, is that it can expand sometimes what we're willing to believe in, mm-hmm. When I was writing this book, when I would talk about it to people, almost every person would say, oh, it's interesting, I don't believe in ghosts, and then within a minute, they would tell me their ghost story. They would tell me the story of the time they saw a ghost. And so, I think a lot of us are in this in-between space of like, we don't believe and we don't not believe and we're not sure, but there is so much anecdotal evidence that so many of us have gathered over the years of, well, that just seems too specific or to whatever. There has to be something to this. Mm-hmm. And of course, death is the end of a conversation with someone you love dearly. And so to think, well, maybe there is a way to keep that conversation going is extremely appealing. And I think it also ties into, just the overarching concept of history. When you go to places like Algonquin, Maine, or even in Central Park in New York City, where every bench has a plaque with someone's name and a little something about them. I think there's something so beautiful about that, that this is someone saying, please remember this person, you know, and so often we just sit on the bench and don't look into it, you know, and I hope more people will do that. I do that. I'm the person on the bench doing the deep Google on whoever that was.
Who are you and why were you there?
You make such wonderful connections between the past and the present in many parts of this book. Do you think those connections are important for all of us?
Oh, I sure do. I think they're so important. Of course. Yes. I think, you know, this idea that really anything we do exists in a vacuum is so untrue. You know, everything we do, the roles we play, the larger culture, and, you know, as individuals, it's like, it really comes down to things that have happened before we even came here, before we were even born. And so I think increasingly, I feel like that is something that the culture gets, you know, that you as an individual are formed by your parents, your grandparents, even relatives you may have never met. And then collectively, we experience this too in these ways that Carol and I were sort of just talking about with, you know, the country itself is sort of founded on slavery, these sort of twin crimes of slavery and the murder of indigenous people, you know, and this idea of kind of, and I think it's really amazing. So when I was writing the book, because I love like a historic home tour or, you know, if you're in New England, like every town has a little museum. I mean, it's so wonderful. And I love those places. So if you drive by and think, who goes there? It's me. I go there. And, you know, I noticed when I was writing the book that a lot of these places are starting to tell a bigger story too. And I love that. So, for example, I live in Milton, Massachusetts, and we have this old house here called the Forbes House that you can tour. And when I was a kid, I liked touring it because I've always loved, you know, to think about, oh, who lived in this house and what were they like and what did they wear and, you know, all of these things. This family is a family of wealthy shipping captains. You know? And that was always the story. This really wealthy, successful family got to live in this wonderful house. Well, now they are starting to talk about, well, let's talk about how the China trade and opium and slavery in the Caribbean and all of these things enriched this family, even though they didn't, you know, live on a plantation in the South. And I should think that's so incredible and so excellent, you know, and that's the kind of thing that I hope we're not going to lose as all of these places are losing funding and being told what they can and cannot talk about and all of that.
Yeah. Yeah, that kind of leads me into my last question for you is because everything you say, are you concerned? I mean, you have two characters that are very different. You have Jane, who really is very involved in the past and history and archives. And you have Genevieve, who wants to take that all apart. And, you know, she's not concerned that she's building her swimming pool on a graveyard, so the bones need to be removed and all of that.
Yeah.
Are you concerned that we're losing our connection to our past?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, I think it's one of those things that if you know, all you have to do is look to see it. But I think more and more and more, we don't look. And I don't know, maybe it's not more and more and more, but, you know, I think so many of us, including myself, are just spending so much time scrolling on Instagram and going down these stupid rabbit holes that we don't need to go down. You know, like I found myself earlier today watching Ozzy Osbourne's funeral on Instagram. And then I'm like, is his son married? Let me Google it. Okay, Ozzy Osbourne's son, wife. Oh, he's divorced. Like, why am I doing that? Who cares? You know, and all of this is time we could be spending on much more interesting things. And so, you know, places like the the Schlesinger Library where Jane works in the book is a real place, and it's a magnificent place. And I could get there in 20 minutes. Do I go there once a week? No, I should. I don't know why. Why do I not? And so I feel like
Um,
that slowing down piece and just kind of remembering, and even, I think it's so interesting to go back to texts from the time itself. So when I was writing Eliza for this book, I read the diaries of a lot of women in Maine during the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
And they were fascinating. And, it's just something I wouldn't have necessarily thought to read. I mean, I think as Jane's teacher says, and she's in high school, and it kind of stays with her, this idea that most lives will be lost to time. And that is true. And it is, I think, I don't know, as a writer, the more researchy parts of my books, I am always trying to bring as many stories back to the light as I can. Hope that people do that in a whole variety of ways.
Well, thanks, Courtney. I love the book. I obviously loved where it was set. So it was a pleasure to meet you.
You too. Thank you so much.
My son is the head of our historic committee in town. My son is 55. Yeah. And they're restoring a building, and he's got the whole history of the building. It was the old town hall. Did they knock it down? What should they do? Looking for funding, grants to, help pay for this, renovation that they're going to do. And he's so interesting because they'll give tours around the town of the different sites. And for the 250th, they're talking about he is going to give the graveyard tour of all graves. And it's weird because they want to do so much more building. I mean, we have this whole thing going on in New Jersey that's driving me crazy of building more housing in these really rural areas. And there are things like you can't make the street any wider because it's a historic area and there are grave sites on this side. Like you can't make it any wider. You can't do things because normally that's what you just do. Widen the road or put more lanes in. There's certain things you just can't do based on the history of where a place is. And I think that going into the 250th, it's going to be really interesting to see people understanding more about just where they live besides the country as a whole. Where do you do, So
yeah, I think it's also, like one of my oldest, best, dearest friends. It's so funny. She doesn't care about this at all. She also grew up here in Massachusetts, and he'll say something like, can you believe they're no longer, whatever it is. Can you believe they're tearing down that? And her answer is always like, so it just doesn't faze her. And so I think, there is a very different way of being about these things, which is just like progress. But,
right.
Yeah.
In fourth grade, I think kids across the country study their state. And we went down and we were building Lenape Indian huts, with, putting the whole thing together. They had a whole way. We went down and did it. And the kids learned so much just by doing that. And this is how you'd make your house. And even though they were in fourth grade and running around, this was really interesting to see this is how things came together. And it's usually that's the grade pretty much across the country. And it's interesting to see what the gateway is going to be in there of teaching the kids, because I think people are they're more apt to talk about what did go wrong before, which they wouldn't have done in the past.
Yes.
Did you have a favorite character to write? Was there one that you just said, okay, I'm here?
My favorites were Eliza and Marilyn.
Okay.
It truly felt a bit like, not like, I wouldn't say I was channeling them, but the more I talked to mediums and interviewed mediums and listened to the way that they described their work or their calling or however they would describe it, they talk about there's all these voices, and how do you choose which ones to tune into, and how they learn to kind of listen to some and not others. And it just, to me, it just felt so similar to writing a novel, where why on earth did I necessarily, go down the path of writing a shaker and writing a painter and writing a medium? I don't know, there's something mystical about it. And I felt like those two characters in particular, they kind of were just telling, I did all the research, so I needed to know so many specific things about the time period and all of that. But then they really just kind of told me what to do.
Story from there. I took the story away from there.
Yeah.
I'm going to do one more thing, and then I'm going to go to a reader comment, and then we're going to go to opening it up to everybody. So if you've got your questions, drop them in the Q&A. I heard that you love audiobooks. I was listening to an
I
interview that you love audiobooks, and this one's got a multicast recording. So let's talk about that for anybody who has not listened to the audio, because I think it's very interesting when that comes together. So tell us about what you loved about putting a multicast for this book.
So it's funny because all my previous books, this is my sixth novel, and previously I've always had the same wonderful editor for the audiobooks. And she'll usually say, so these are the people I'm thinking of, you know, and I'm always like, that's great, because I have no idea who she's talking about and I don't know anything about audiobooks. But now I've entered a phase of my life where I listen to so many books on audio and I have very strong opinions about certain readers. There are certain people
Yes.
who I love the way they read so much that I will read a book just because they're the person narrating the book.
Mhm.
And so I was thrilled with the names that they shared with me. I thought, oh my God, the person who's doing Marilyn, she does the voice of Olive Kittredge. And it was like I was starstruck by a lot of these people who were chosen and or asked. And I remember asking my audio editor, like, she named names and I said, oh my God, do you think she would do it really? And she's like, yeah, that's her job. She's, that's what she does. But I have never listened to any of my own books on audio. I think I would just like die of embarrassment. So I've never done that, but I have heard really wonderful things about this particular book. And yeah, as a reader, I just think audiobooks are wonderful. And I kind of feel like, a few years ago, there was this conversation about like, are they even really books? And I have no interest in that conversation. Yes, they are.
Yes, they are. Absolutely. Especially memoirs. I love listening to memoirs, especially if it's read by the person that does a really good job.
Yeah.
Fabulous. So Rose Erin Price from Sarasota, Florida, has a question that she asked me to share on her behalf. As an author, what are your thoughts on the recent proliferation of novels using increasingly complex flashbacks and multiple viewpoints, as in the case in The Cliffs? Sometimes I find myself craving the simplicity of a linear narrative told by one character. So, talk to us about that, because you're writing differently if you're doing that as well. So, what was the challenge? What is the good, the bad, the ugly?
That's interesting that she sort of describes it as like an increase in that, because I don't know if that actually is true or not. Is there an increase in books with that? But there are some like that. Like I think about the Poisonwood Bible by Barbara Kingsolver, one of my favorite books ever. Such a great book. As a reader, I am with her. I actually don't love reading a book with too many points of view, because sometimes like, oh, I want to get back to that one. I want to get back to that character. But as a writer, I can only write this way. I'm always thinking my next book will just have one point of view, or maybe even two. And I just, every time it turns out like this. And I think it's because whether I'm writing a contemporary book about, a family, or a book like this that spans history, the characters are always connected in some way. And I want to see them in conversation with one another, not just really literally in conversation, but also what do they think of each other? What do they know about each other? What are they not saying? And, the best way to get into that is to just give us all of them.
Yeah.
But I get it. I get it. Although I just read this novel, Bug Hollow by Michelle Hunovan. Did you read that?
I read it.
I absolutely loved it so much. And she kept bringing in new characters, and I loved every single one. I was like, yes, okay. I did not see that coming, but yes, it's a wonderful, wonderful book.
Well defined characters. That will matter as well, as that you really know who the people are.
Yeah.
I know, it's like, so Tom, voice of God, do you have any questions from the audience?
Yes, we do have some good questions here. First question is from Christina. She says, I love that the house was the starting point of this novel and the foundation that the characters evolved from. How did you decide the way you would weave the women's stories together and what stories you wanted to highlight?
I love that question. Because again, it's kind of like, yeah, it could be, as in any novel, it could be anything. They could do anything. And there's something that's amazing about that, and also can be kind of overwhelming about that. Like, which stories do I tell? And as I said before, there's really only one story from the house that I didn't include in the book, which is the two sisters who own the house for a long time, between Eliza's partner. Sorry, my dog is gagging. He's 15 and he's now gagging, which is really gross. But that's just a thing he does. Sorry. And so, sorry, I got distracted by my dog gagging. Oh, so those two, I kept thinking, but it's supposed to be about everyone, all the women who lived in this house and on this land. And so I have to talk about them. But I felt like at the end of the day, I told a little bit of their story, but I didn't feel like they had enough connection with the other characters.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't somehow in conversation with the others. I don't even know how to explain that, but that's how it felt to me, that their story was very isolated. They just happened to be in the house, for the period between the others. But, and so I gave them, I think I told in the last chapter, like about one paragraph, this is what this is what was going to happen with those characters, in case anyone was wondering, but I never, fully brought them in, because I actually felt like it would be a bit too much. It felt like this was going back to the previous question, how many stories can we hold in our heads at once and care about,
The 500-page novel. The 500-page novel. Do we need it?
Right. And that's the other thing. It's like, when I want to write from one point of view, and I never do, I always want to write a short novel. I love a short novel, and it seems like it would be easier. I don't necessarily think it would be easier. I think it's just it's like writing a poem versus writing a short story. It's just like a different thing. But the book I'm writing right now, people for a long time would ask me, what's your book about? And I would say it's about being 300 pages long, because that was my dream. But it's already longer than that, and it's not done. So never mind.
Tell your editor, I want it down to 300 pages.
Yes.
Less paper. We're okay. We're on that.
That's right.
Donna says, I read your book 2 times. What is your character's deepest wound, and how does it shape the actions and dreams throughout the story? Would you think it's the house?
Ooh, I love that. What a wonderful. Well, thank you for reading it twice. That's amazing. I really appreciate
Right.
that. What is your character's deepest wound? Ooh, I love that. I think for Jane, if Jane is the character, she means, I think it's this sense of loneliness, of sort of isolation, of not feeling like she really fits anywhere. And, admiring and revering the past in ways that are really good, but also, even she, knowing all she does about that, tells stories about the past that aren't true, and so she feels like her grandmother was this perfect person, and she wishes her mother could have been more like her grandmother. And one of the ways, in which maybe her mother could have been different, is if she hadn't been a drinker. And here, of course, eventually Jane learns her grandmother also struggled with this same illness that the rest of them in the family do. And it had terrible consequences in her life as well. I think, there's something about, you come into the world and there's these people in your family. You just, know them as they are. Your grandmother as a 70-year-old woman, or whatever she is at the time you come into the world, and become aware. And even for someone like Jane, it's challenging to say, oh, she had a whole life before I was here. what was that life? And to see her as anything other than exactly what she is standing right in front of you.
Mhm. Mm.
We have a question from Gail. Your characters have complicated lives. How did their lives develop in your writing process? Do you outline or do you let the characters speak?
Mm, I let the characters speak, and I I don't know. I know, many fiction writers who I know and love their work. They outline, and I don't really know. I wouldn't know how to do that. I'm not an outliner. I usually know when I'm starting a book, this is how the book will start and this is how the book will end. And then I
Uh-huh.
don't really know how am I getting from A to Z, what's going to happen in between to get me there. And I don't know, there's something really kind of scary, but also really thrilling about that. And like starting a chapter and developing the connections as I go along. So, oh, I didn't know that character, went to high school with that character. Oh, did they date? Oh, they did? Oh, well, are they gonna meet up again? Like whatever. It's all like happening as I'm writing it. And so that can lead to like my book Saints for All Occasions. I threw away 400 pages and started again because I had gotten myself into such a tangle and really wasn't telling the story I should be telling. And so that was painful. And after that, I did think, how do I become, it's kind of like me wanting to write the 300-page novel. How do I become someone who knows what's going to happen? But that to me just like would not be exciting. And I don't think I could write a book in that way.
Now, I know that you mentioned this earlier. You were talking about this a little earlier. Mary says in the acknowledgments, you mentioned research for the book at Sabbath Day Lake Shaker Village. According to the Smithsonian Institute, as of June this year, as you mentioned, there were only two surviving Shakers, brother Arnold Had and sister June Carpenter, and they still live in that village. Did you happen to meet either of them? It is such a fascinating religious group, and you described and explored it so well through the character of Sister Eliza.
Thank you. So I've been to Sabbath Day Lake several times, as I said, as a child, but also while researching this book. And I never did meet them. I have watched so many interviews that Brother Arnold has done and sort of learned so much from him just listening to his story of how he came to be at the Shaker Village and what it means. And he has brought I think something about the Shakers that there's a lot of different, faith backgrounds that we kind of mush together, I guess. So you might think of the Shakers as similar to like the Amish or Mennonites or whatever it might be, but each of these groups has a different relationship to technology. And so the Shakers, they have always been extremely pro technology because they believe in doing work to sort of serve God, that is how you serve God, is by working very hard. And so, whether it was machines that made it easier to make garments or, now the internet, Brother Arnold is very present on the internet. And he is often talking about what it is to be a Shaker, what the history of the Shakers is. And so I feel like I learned quite a lot from him firsthand, but I've never met him. What's interesting about Sabbath Day Lake is that even though there are only two Shakers, this is a huge piece of land. This is a real working farm. And they have so many people interested in them. They have so many volunteers who keep the place going. And so it's beautiful and kind of fascinating because yes, there are only two Shakers. There are only two people committed to that particular very specific faith, which includes celibacy, no family relations, no parent-child relations, marriage, any of that. But there are people who are so fascinated by the Shakers and go there and give a lot of their time to the place. And that allows it to continue on as it has been for so long.
Hmm.
So I did talk to a lot of the volunteers, but I never talked to Brother Arnold.
Bring him a book. Bring him the book.
Well, I know Brother Arnold's. It's funny because if you like watch something, like if you're an obsessive like me and you watch every single interview he's done, you kind of like, oh, I think I know what he would think of this, and I feel like he might not like it. I'm not sure. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't know.
Send him a note. Have him listen in.
Yep.
So actually, we don't have any more questions, so I think that puts a wrap on the Q&A.
Okay. So you
But thank you,
alluded
Courtney, so
to.
much for your very insightful and thoughtful answers.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for tuning in. This has been great.
So what's next for you? When do we get to see it? So when?
I hope
Your
soon.
300-page novel.
Yes, the 300-page novel that's already like 350. I am writing this novel, so all of my books have in some way, good or bad, contained some kind of self-fulfilling prophecy where I write a thing and then it happens. In the Cliffs, I ended up moving to my hometown, as Jane does. I ended up moving into an old Victorian house. And I realized when doing that ghosts are the least scary thing about an old house. This house is terrifying because it has leaky ceilings and wooden gutters. That's what's really scary. If a ghost came in, I'd say like, how did you deal with the gutters? That's what I would ask them 100 years ago. But my husband and I, knowing this phenomenon happens with all of my books, we have long joked about, when am I going to write a book about a lottery winner? Because let's see if we can get this self-fulfilling prophecy to really, and that's what I'm doing. I'm right. This joke became a thing where I did start developing a story around it. And so I'm writing this book about a small town in Massachusetts where somebody wins the Powerball, and it's like a more community, it has these really specific 4 narrators, but it's kind of the whole town who, trying to figure out who it is, who's the winner, and talking about like who deserves that and doesn't, and getting into the idea of sort of class and money and all of that through this one particular moment that occurs.
One particular moment. That's what's going to happen. Maybe you're clairvoyant about you winning. Now you have to get the scratch offs every week.
I hope so.
It is part of research. It is for research.
What? I actually told my husband, because I had a character who, she has no money, but she always feels like she's right on the brink of winning, which I think many people do, and so she just has no money, and she ends up with $100. And she knows what she should do with the $100, but she just spends it on scratch tickets. And so last week I was writing that chapter, and I was like, not really, I don't know, it wasn't quite happening. So I said to my husband, like, do you want to go on a field trip with me? And we went to this convenience store, and we bought $100 worth of scratch tickets, which like never would we do that. But I'm like, this is for research. This is for work. We must do this. And
you win.
My husband, so we each got a $50 ticket. I got nothing because I never went on a scratch ticket. My husband got $100. So we broke even. And the right thing to do would be say, good job, and leave. But of course, myself, I'm like, no, we got to keep going, and then we lost all of it. But that's what I had happen to the character when I got home. I'm like, that is what would happen to her. Okay, good. I'm putting that in the chapter.
Well, my father gives them out every year for Christmas. He gives us the lottery tickets, and $2 or something like that. It doesn't matter. It's just the fun of the scratching off,
It's fun.
And my last question for you is, why the J before Courtney Sullivan? I've always wondered what that stood for, number one. And when I was setting up this conversation, I actually said to your publicist, do I call her J? Do I call her Courtney? Do I call her J Courtney? It was one of those really funny things. She just wrote back, you can call her Courtney. I was like, you can call me Al. Like, you can call me Courtney. So there you go. So
I know sometimes I get emails and they're just like, dear J. And I'm like, oh God, they think I just go by the letter J. In my mom's family, Irish Catholic family, this is so specific, but all of the firstborn girls are named, actually most of the girls until my mother's generation, my generation, are named Mary. And so they all go by their middle names because just to tell them apart. And so, everyone is M whatever, M my mother is M. Joyce. Her grandmother was M. Patricia. And so with me, they kept this tradition going of the first initial, but named me Julie, not Mary. I don't know.
So Julie, but you never called Julie. You're Courtney.
That's right, except I'm named after my Aunt Julie, and she calls me Julie, and other people call me Julie when she's there.
Well, I have a similar story. My husband is William Thomas Fitzgerald. We call him Tom. His father was William. Oh, wait. So I am saying to my husband, we will never do this to our child, ever.
Yeah.
We are never going to do this. I'm about 8.5 months pregnant, completely vulnerable to like whatever. And he says, his father passed away before I'd even met him. And he says to me, I'd really like to name him after my father. And I was like, what? And he says, William. And I'm like, we're not going to call him William or Bill or any of these things. And I said, we'll pick a middle name and that's what he'll go by, right? So it's William Gregory Fitzgerald. But they bring me the baby in the hospital and they said, William had a great night last night. And I said, who's William? Okay. And they immediately looked at my wristband and said, like, is this the mother? I said, oh, his name is Greg. And it completely threw the entire place off. And it's like that lunatic down the hall, get her home soon so she can bond with a child whose name she doesn't know. And I was just there like, so I said, okay, here's the deal. That could be his name, but the birth announcements are going out as W. Gregory Fitzgerald. They're not.
Oh, wow. So you have that.
So we did the same thing. We did the same thing. It was all great until 9/11, when everybody had to go back to their given name. So we would literally be in the airport and they go, will William Fitzgerald come to the front desk? And I'd be looking like, and Greg would get up. I was like, why are you moving? He goes, that's my name. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm as bad as when I was in the hospital with you.
That's so true, because for me, it was never a thing until I was like applying to college. And I remember going to, one interview and they said, where's your sister? When I got to the on-campus interview, they said, where's your sister? And I said, what do you mean? And they said, well, do you have a twin sister? Because there's a Julie with this birth date and a Courtney with this birthday. I'm like, no, we're the same. And throughout my life, there's been so many things like that. And then with my daughter, people in my family were like, are you keeping the tradition? And I was like, sorry, I'm not. I'm killing it. Because it's just a pain in the neck.
They get mail. It's to William, like which William in the family?
Yes.
No, it's ridiculous.
I know. I go to doctor's appointments. They say Julie Sullivan. I'm sitting there for like 30 seconds before I go, oh, yeah, that's me. It's really weird.
And it's like, William, and they go, do you want to go? Or they're bringing him back to the room and they go, do you want to be called William or Bill? And he's like, Greg. And they're like, you get Greg out of those names. Yeah.
Yes. I remember having a professor in college who said, okay, Julie. And I said, oh, I go by Courtney. And they were like, what the hell is that? What do you mean you go by Courtney?
Yeah, exactly. Courtney, it has been a pleasure finally meeting you and being able to discuss this book. Thank you so much for your time. You were so generous with us and really, really appreciate it. We hope to have you back again as a guest after the 300-page book comes out.
I would love it. After I win the Powerball, I will be back on. You'll see me in a gilded mansion the next time we're talking.
We should have little scratch off cards for the next time. We'll just be giving those out to everyone. Everyone scratch off before the meeting. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll let you get back to cutting your pages back. Go ahead. Let's see if you can do it.
My children have been suspiciously quiet, so let's go see what they've been up to. That's my next move.
That's exactly. It's like, wait, what are they doing? And what are they eating before bed?
That's right.
Thanks so much. Have a great rest of the summer.
You too. Thanks, Carol.
Thanks so much. And to everybody else, we have a couple of announcements from us. Tonight's event will be available on YouTube and on our podcast soon, and we'll alert you when that's live. Our producer is actually going on vacation, so I'm hoping to get her before she leaves. We also have a new events page on TBR Network where you can sign up for all of our programs. So make sure you go out and look out there. Our next Bookaccino Live book group event is going to be in September. We don't know who the guest is going to be yet. We've got a couple of thoughts going on that. We're not scheduling August program because we're going to be grabbing a week off at the end of August. Our week off where I can stand in the pool and read books like The Cliff so that I can be doing an event next summer. No, I'm joking, but we really will be doing a lot of reading that week. It's one of my big goals. Our August Bookaccino Live book group preview event is going to be on Wednesday, August 13th at 2:00 in the afternoon. So we hope you can join us for that. And if you sign up for our events newsletter, you'll never miss an event. We always send that out at least once a month to tell you what's coming up. And a reminder, we have more than 230 Book Reporter Talks to author interviews available on our YouTube channel, the Book Report Network, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. I hope you enjoyed this evening as much as I did. I can't believe I haven't met J. Courtney before, and I'm looking forward to having her back as a guest again. So thanks, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your summer.